Thoreau was a contemporary of Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix was born in Hampden, Maine. She was the granddaughter of a wealthy land baron. Her own father was an alcoholic who's had many jobs, one of which included being an itinerant Methodist preacher. At the age of 12, Dorothea left her home, which was chaotic, to live with her grandmother in Boston in her grandfather's mansion, which was not chaotic but rather cold emotionally. But she finished her schooling there, and she went on to start a school at age 19. And she also worked as a nanny for William Ellery Channing, who was the founder of the Unitarian Association. And she wrote meditations and religious poetry for children and families. She was both intellectual and devotional. Listen to this poem to her mind and to God. Awake, awake, my mind, thy reasoning power bestow, with intellect refined. The God who formed thee, know. Reason was her pathway to God, whom she saw as the source of all reason. Her emphasis on reason also caused her to distrust her passion. She wrote often about her difficulty controlling her anger. And despite some suitors, she never married. Despite her success as a young adult, there was a stern sadness about her. Her moral tales for children often portrayed parents as poor role models and the duty of the children to rise above them, a reflection of her own life. I think in modern parlance we would have said she was a parentified child. She often faced bouts of melancholy, and she moved out of her grandmother's mansion and found comfort in the home of Channing. And she accompanied the family on a trip to the Caribbean for the benefit of Mrs. Channing's health. And she looked forward to this trip because she was an amateur botanist, and she just said it was a whole new world for her to explore. But once she got there, she felt immobilized. She felt that she had no energy to do anything. For almost 3 months, she stayed in bed most of the time, and she mused, "How strangely is the human mind constituted, and strange its deep, mysterious motions." Then, as suddenly as the melancholy hit, it lifted, and she thoroughly enjoyed the rest of her trip, examining and cataloging the flora and fauna. And she returned to Boston more upbeat than ever. Yet she was dissatisfied with having no great purpose in her life. She hesitated to return to teaching and writing, fearing that it would lead her back to her melancholy ways. But eventually she resumed teaching because it was the way to earn a living. But she was dissatisfied and no longer had her youthful optimism. And Emerson cautioned her, "I fear you are doing too much for others and not enough to take care of yourself." And she ignored his advice and the advice of many people till finally they took up a collection and decided to send her on a cruise to England, and Channing had her live with a friend of his out there. It was a common thing for the upper classes to take these respites and restorative vacations. She went to Liverpool outskirts and was living with the mayor of that town, who was part of the English progressive movement talking a lot about government-sponsored poorhouses and insane asylums, but she was too involved at first in her own malady. She had this underlying feeling that her sickness was somehow a result of sin. And she couldn't figure out what her sin had been. But she wrote, "God never withholds the train of results he annexes to wrong conduct. And the pain that visits the involuntary transgression is often our first index of a broken law." And so her way of thinking is, since I am melancholy and sick, I must have done something. I disagree with her. I think her sin may have been following too closely the saying of Jesus, "Be perfect even as your Father in heaven is perfect." She worked so hard believing that the slightest defect made her a total failure. The optimistic Unitarian philosophy of human progress towards perfection, instead of liberating her, became a burden for her. She wrote that it could feel unholy to be happy. She used her time in England at the Rathbone home as her own private country asylum, and she found the time there restored her. She read a lot of books on early government poor laws and state-sponsored relief, and she took particular interest in the York Asylum for Insane Persons, where the insane were controlled not by chains and straitjackets, but by moral therapy, encouraging self-management and moral reasoning as the goal. The people were helped by instilling the feeling of family. And this is the warm feeling that Dorothea felt for the first time when she moved in with the Rathbones at the age of 34. Though her asylum was informal, it transformed her. She would return home to the USA and eventually seek that solution for many. In 1841, she began to survey the homes of the insane. She went all across the poorhouses and the prisons and anywhere in any town where she asked, "Is there any insane people here?" And then she would go and she would catalog their living conditions using those same skills that she had as a botanist to carefully describe every situation that she saw. It seems that focusing on the afflictions of others made her forget her own. And she wrote a report to the Massachusetts legislature. "I proceed, gentlemen, to briefly call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this Commonwealth, in cages, in stalls, pens, chained naked, beaten with rods, and lashed to obedience." It was a bold step for a woman of her day to enter into the world of politics. Even more stunning was her success. She was able to make improvements in the Massachusetts treatment of the mentally ill, and then went on to survey other states, from Maine to Missouri, creating state homes all across the eastern part of the nation. In 1848, she was in North Carolina. She surveyed the state and recommended that they build an asylum at the cost of $100,000. The state budget was about $200,000 at the time. They questioned whether the northern lady, with her extravagant scheme, really knew her business. And her first appropriation bill was roundly defeated. But she persevered, and she was living at the home of Senator James Dobbin, whose wife was dying. And she opened her heart to her and cared for Ms. Dobbin until her death. And on her deathbed, Mrs. Dobbins told her husband, "Do whatever you can to help Miss Dix." So he returned from the funeral, and everybody knew where he had returned from, and gave an impassioned speech and a financial plan that to pay the costs over time. So the first year's appropriation was only $7,000, and it passed easily. The asylum would be funded on a pay-as-you-go basis, but chronic underfunding caused it to take 8 years to build. And as we heard from Steve Weston today, the Dorothy Dix Center, which is still on that site, is still a source of state budget battles. Dorothea Dix had a profound influence on this nation's care for the mentally ill. Her proposal for asylums was more humane than the neglect or the punishments of the day. But over the years, asylums came to represent the mistreatment of the mentally ill. People were shipped off to the countryside and forgotten. Ken Kesey's novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, dramatized the cruelty of this system. In the 60s and the 70s, many state hospitals were closed. Deinstitutionalization was seen as liberating the mentally ill, but there was no funding on the outside to give them the necessary social support, and many became homeless and marginalized. The changes in treatment reflects how insanity and illness have been redefined over the years. During Dix's day, germ theory was not a part of physical medicine. An illness, mental or physical, was perceived part as the result of the moral choice a person made, sometimes even demon possession. Additionally, disease had a random nature to it. Doctors unaware of the causes could only offer palliative care, treatment to reduce the pain of symptoms. With the advent of germ theory, doctors found themselves better able to treat physical ailments, while mental illness still remained a mystery. Treatment of the body was possible, and the two spheres of medicine separated. Somehow the mind was separated from the body. Unless there was a clear brain injury, such as stroke or lesions in the case of epilepsy, mental illness was not considered a medical problem. Somehow it was a problem of the mind and not of the brain. Dix's suggestion was moral therapy. Create a peaceful social world where the insane could learn to live with others. Half a century later, Sigmund Freud would suggest that moral therapy was the problem, a symptom of an overactive superego which leads to repression and the uncontrolled impulses of the id exploding unpredictably to the surface. The solution was individual talk therapy, where the person was able to resolve the conflicts in themselves. In the middle of the 20th century, psychiatry began treating illness with medication. And at first it was used merely as a medical straitjacket. Given enough tranquilizer, the most frenzied person will calm down. And when that did not work, a lobotomy could remove part of the brain. The mind was reconnected to the body, but the treatments were crude. and mental health remains separate from other forms of health care. Recent research shows that many disorders and addictions have been linked to disorders in brain chemistry. Medications are given to adjust serotonin levels. In some way, the brain is considered again like an organ, like the pancreas. If the pancreas does not produce enough insulin, insulin is given. Medication is given to adjust levels. But it's not that easy. Because if you've had schizophrenia and you have felt paranoid and that everyone is against you, you have probably made some enemies. If over the next week, just go and talk to everybody, and whenever they say something, ask them, what did you really mean by that? Most of your friends will quit talking to you by the end of the week. And so that even if the delusional thinking is stopped with chemistry, there's still the whole social support system of people that have been wounded in interactions with this person and real wounds that the person has felt too. It's a very complex thing, mental illness. And we haven't been able to find one answer. There's still a stigma that exists. It is still perceived as a failure to cope. And I have felt this stigma, for I have been treated for depression. In 1990, I tried Prozac, and it didn't do much. Depression interfered with my ability to work as a hospice social worker, and I worked at temporary agencies for minimum wage. I had a new family. I felt like a failure. The chemistry didn't help me. I found some respite by taking steps to become a UU minister. During my internship, I did feel a renewed purpose in life. I felt like I was in sync with what I should be doing. Even though the financial difficulties remained, there was a social solution that pulled me out of my malaise. After my internship, I returned to social work and earned a living until I could jump through the hoops that would let me be a UU minister. And my depression lifted, even though my work with AIDS patients certainly gave me enough fodder to become depressed. I eventually found my first parish in Maryland in 1996, and I'd fulfilled a major goal in my life. I had kept quiet about my bouts with depression, figuring it was in my past and that revealing my weakness might hurt my chances at a future. I was a hypocrite. As a social worker and minister, I freely recommended to my clients and my members to seek treatment to overcome the stigma, but I was unable to do it myself. In 1998, I was depressed again. It may have been chemical, it may have been situational. The founder of my 2-year-old church had been convicted of pedophilia, which split the congregation. And I was living in suburban sprawl, which seemed like a very soulless place to live. And so I don't know whether these were the causes of my depression or just the focus of an obsessive melancholy that came on to me biologically. I sought the help of psychiatrists, and she prescribed Zoloft, which worked. And though all my problems in the parish and living situation still maintained, I had a good 2 years of managing them well before I came here. I recognized my limitations and agreed to work within them. In some ways, I was like Dorothea dicks. I demanded a perfection of myself that I would never expect of others. As a social worker, minister, healer, I felt it necessary to hide any weakness. Last week, Frank Benedetti gave a speech about coming out for gay people, and in some ways, this sermon is my coming out speech. Although I'm not currently depressed or on medication, I recognize that I've needed help in the past, and given the nature of the disease, I probably will need it in the future. It doesn't go away by pretending that it doesn't exist. Denial is the illusion of strength. By recognizing, admitting my brain's tendency towards depression, I can be more vigilant for symptoms and take measures to organize my life and provide self-care, which may prevent the slide. Currently, when some bad things happen to me or I make a mistake, I look at it realistically and try to improve the situation. When suffering from depression, I tend to take responsibility for all that is wrong with my life and the world. Instead of seeking possible solutions, I focus blame on my own limitations and failures. I say I'm sorry so much that I drive my wife mad, in a manner of speaking. Even as I give this sermon, I have some worry that some of you may respect me less because I have exposed some weakness. And I need to ask myself, what is the good of being perceived as perfect? And then also, that if I think that you guys think I'm perfect, that's probably delusional thinking. I saw a bumper sticker this week that said, "I would rather be hated for what I am than loved for what I am not." My need to be perfect is messianic and not healthy. I and this fellowship will be healthier if we accept each other's imperfections while working for mutual improvement. We are learning more about the biochemical nature of mental illness, but that is not to say that there is not a social component. The definition of mental illness is still bound up with social convention. In many circles, angels watching over me is a socially acceptable statement. Touched by an angel is considered an inspirational program. Aliens watching over me is a less accepted statement. And the X-Files is labeled as science fiction. And I'm tempted, but I won't ask for a show of hands. I'm not sure which would win out in this congregation, the belief in aliens or angels. After terrorist airplanes and anthrax in the mail, what is our socially acceptable definition of paranoia? Antidepressants are sometimes given to a grieving person. Is grief depression? Should we ever allow ourselves to be sad? And who decides when a person should be getting over a trauma? Who decides whether or not it's time to give some relief with medication? ADHD is on the rise, with some debate of whether it even exists. I've heard that it's probably the most over-medicated and under-medicated disease at the same time, with many who could benefit from medicine not getting treatment, and many who have no business being on medicine being prescribed. Are kids hectic because their parents' lives are hectic? Or has undiagnosed mental illness in the parents been passed genetically to their children? The nature and nurture questions get tangled. And what about the calm parents who are faced with a rowdy kid? Are white kids more likely to be diagnosed as ADHD and treated, while minority children are cast off as delinquent? Do delinquents suffer from antisocial personality disorder? What is the balance as we live with each other, with all our frailties, between personal responsibility and social understanding? We have a long way to go in treating mental illness. Insurance companies separate it and segregate it from other forms of health care, as if the brain was not a part of the body. And this adds to the stigma and the shame. There's an idea that an illness is not real if it's in the mind. We need to form a society where people are unafraid to admit they need help. We need a society that is tolerant of varying abilities to function. We need to ask whether it is sane to be adjusted to an insane society. Are people who are able to work 70 hours per week and never get depressed sane? After their heart attack, the tombstone will read, "Here lies a sane person." Is war sane? I once heard a report on NPR that depressed people are more knowledgeable about world events and suffering. Is knowledge power? Is ignorance bliss? Dorothea Dix responded to her own psychic woundedness by seeking improvement for some in the world around her. Her solution was imperfect, but it was an improvement. Today I ask all of us to examine our emotional lives. In what ways can we improve? And what realities and limitations will we accept about ourselves? How do we accept one another and encourage spiritual growth? I open the floor to you. Let us now share with each other the speculations of our minds.
I think that most people here have a lot of respect for you for saying what you said. My sister was diagnosed schizophrenic, and she spent 25 years of her life in the state hospital and died there. My oldest daughter, at 16, was diagnosed schizophrenic, and we were told by a local doctor that she was suicidal, so she had to be hospitalized. She underwent 28 shock treatments, which later I found maybe would have been 5 at the current time, but that was a procedure in the hospital that she was in locally. But my daughter lived at a time when there was, even though they didn't know as much as they know now, there was a great deal more known about medical intervention, so we did everything we could find. And she's presently teaching doctors nutrition in California with a degree in nutrition and a degree, and she's probably going for a PhD. When my daughter was sick, I was starting teaching here, and having had a sister who was schizophrenic, and a daughter who was diagnosed and living with this, I taught very difficult children in high school who were not diagnosed, because at that time there was no diagnosis for behavioral problems, because they didn't have the money, so one of the reasons why. I was teaching special, we were supposed to be learning disabled and moderately retarded students, but I got everyone in the what you have to do. You know, I don't think that every problem has a solution, but I think that people who are troubled need to feel that we really care. That is the beginning of any kind of solution, that we have compassion. And we have to share we have to show that we really care, and we have to show that we're vulnerable and not perfect. And that's the beginning of some kind of solution. But of course now, as John said, there are medical things that were never known before. And if people have an opportunity for treatment, then many people don't have to be unhappy and ill and troubled to the extent that they would have been 20 or 30 years ago. So I'm really very glad. I think you have probably was difficult to decide to say the things you said. But I think that there's people who won't say anything, but who can really reflect on what you said and what they know about you.
Thanks.
So again, I think you gain respect probably from everybody here.
Charlie, I too commend you on your courage. I work for Centerpoint. I just want to mention a couple things about mental health parity bill. Centerpoint, we work with a lot of folks who are indigent, but actually, in terms of behavioral health care portions of healthcare plans, you see that lifetime exemption. Well, once a person's been hospitalized once, it's shot. Okay? And after that, it's a real struggle for any family to pay for mental health care. I want to mention a resource in the community, maybe it helps us some folks. It's called the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. There's a Forsyth County chapter, and they have a family support group. Another thing is Steve Weston was talking about mental health reform. The state does have a reform plan. You can make comments between now and December 1st. You can get there on the web by www.gov.nc.us, and you go to Department of Health and Human Services links, and you can see that plan. It's about 300 pages in length. I made some comments, and I encourage you to look at it and make comments too, so that the state is responsive to consumers, families of people who have been homeless.
Hi, I want to thank you for coming out. I'd like to come out too. I suffer from depression. One thing, I look around, there are dozens of meetings in this city for Alcoholics Anonymous, Al-Anon, Nar-Anon. I don't know of any self-help group for people with depression, and maybe we could start one here.
That'll make a segue. So many people that are depressed self-medicate with substance abuse.
Well, she said nobody would ever mention the place that had an obsession. Well, I've had an obsession. I went to the emergency room with somebody several months ago. I have epilepsy. And sometimes I pass out. And when I don't pass out, it doesn't bother me when I have a seizure. But when I have seizures where I pass out and go to the emergency room and I wake up in the emergency room, I guess it did bother me. And I obsessed about taking this person down to the emergency room. And I had feelings when I was in the emergency room. And my sister told me later, why did you do that? Why did you go down to the emergency room? Don't you hate sisters? They're always right, you know. Because she told me, you know, back in April, she said, you were obsessing. You were obsessing. That's what you get. So what my obsession did, it made me feel like I was actually, when I got up in the morning, and in a way still a little bit now, but not as much, because I figured out when I got up in the morning that I'd been in the emergency room the night before, you know, and then it was the day after, you know. I know that probably doesn't make any sense to anybody, but, you know, I've read before about people always having obsession and compulsive disorders, and I thought, well, I don't have that, you know, how would somebody get that? then finally, I got, you just think about something, you know, over and over and over and over and over. And it's funny, you know, some things don't bother me. I can watch horror movies, you know. I can do lots of other things. Bugs don't bother me. My niece, she cannot stand bugs. You know, she runs out of the room. Kill it! You kill it! I'll be back in a minute. Oh, that doesn't bother me. But the emergency room, just really, I can remember each seizure and the way I felt when I woke up, you know, and then the day after. And when I start talking about that, then I start getting this feeling, you know. And it's very interesting, you know. Anyway, and you said nobody would admit that they were having an obsession.
The obsession is often characterized as my sense of purpose.
Just a quick note in the news. Since September 11th, New York's usage of antidepressants and sedatives is up 30%. Nationwide, it's up 5%. So if anybody thinks they're not affected by this, probably we all are affected by this. I myself had sleep disorder for several days after watching those towers go down. They just kept recurring in my mind. But that's that little or not, so I certainly needed a fight set myself.
This is a related subject. In the last couple of weeks, I had an 8th grade boy, who of course will go unnamed, in my middle school, who threatened something really terrible, to destroy our school and to smoke other children, smoke being killed. And I guess I am, in a way, was fortunate enough to hear him, along with the PE teacher, together. And we were able to at least gently encourage him to go down to the office and talk to the assistant principal, and during which a lot of this came out. And I was very thankful, and I really am, that there is a system in place in our schools that is humane and that enables children to be helped and dealt with. The child was sent home, but a social worker specifically is going to be visiting him at home for the 10 days that he'll be home before he goes into kind of, it's called a re-entry program, where he'll be working with one-on-one for about 40 days. And I did not have this last year at Hayes Elementary School, where I was. This year at the Hayes Middle School, there are a lot of options, which I'm very thankful for, because there are so many children like this young man who are having difficulties adjusting and have issues. And he told the assistant principal that he was really happy to be able to talk to somebody. And that gave me pause to think. And I just wanted to share that with you.
Let us close with our hymn 181.